Welcome to Candlesleep Tales. Tonight we stray into one of the stranger corners of medieval festivity, one that is not wholly invention but has been recorded by chroniclers of the age. Cat burning, as it was called, was practiced in places like Paris during midsummer, where crowds gathered to watch baskets of animals thrown into the flames in the name of purification. What follows is a fictional rendering, but it rests on the frame of events that truly did occur. Our story will follow one ordinary soul through such a festival, watching him stand in the crowd as the flames rise and the baskets swing. And since I'm the one telling it now, not that other fellow you might remember, you'll notice the jokes land sharper, the sighs heavier, and the irony perhaps a little more personal. Before we begin, if you enjoy these unsettling glimpses into the past, do make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Tell us in the comments, which medieval custom do you think you would have survived least well? The cobbler's apprentice was not given a choice. His master told him the midsummer festival was a civic duty, and the craftsman's reputation suffered if he did not stand among the crowd when the torches were lit. A man who skipped the burning was a man with secrets, or worse, a man with sympathies. And so, on that particular morning, he was ordered to brush his hair, wipe the pitch off his hands, and come stand in the square with everyone else. The apprentice would have preferred to stay behind with his lasts and awls, working leather into something more forgiving than the sun-baked cobbles of the street. He was young enough to imagine that silence and work were safer companions than smoke and ritual, but he was also young enough to obey. His master had phrased it carefully. People buy shoes when they're stepping on hot ash. The apprentice wasn't sure if this was a proverb, or just a sort of wisdom a cobbler invented to drag his underling to a spectacle. Either way, the logic was iron-bound. No man questions the knot once it is tied. And so he followed the press of people, walking toward the square. The crowd was already swelling, spilling out from the timbered houses like water running downhill. Children tugged at their mothers' sleeves, whispering about the cages that had been dragged into the square at dawn. He heard them mewling before he saw them. A sound like torn cloth, high and raw, drifting above the chatter. It struck him, as it had struck him before, how strange the world was about its fears. A century earlier, the town had been on its knees from the plague. He remembered his grandmother's stories, black swellings in the groin, priests marching day and night, whole families lowered into pits. Rats, she said, had owned the streets. Fleas jumped from rat to man with a hunger that no sermon could answer. In those years, a cat had been the best companion a family could keep. Quicker than a trap, hungrier than the vermin, a little streak of survival padded in fur. But memory was short, or perhaps memory was too long and twisted. For here was the midsummer festival, and here were the townsfolk marching toward the square to watch cats burned in their baskets, the devil driven out by fur and flame. The apprentice walked with the rest, pretending he did not hear the mewling, pretending he did not smell the burlap sacks, warm and damp in the sun, pretending this was all just another day when the town demanded cheer, demanded obedience, demanded the proof of loyalty that could only be purchased with cruelty. He wished, not for the first time, that the Black Death had burned into men's minds as deeply as it burned through their lungs. If they remembered, truly remembered, then cats would be set at the table, not on the pyre. But the world was not ruled by memory, it was ruled by tradition. And tradition, once tied in rope, is harder to slip than any plague. By the time the apprentice reached the square, the place had swollen into a market of noise and anticipation. Stalls lined the edges, selling skewers of spiced meat and cups of sour wine. Joggers tossed pins through the hot air, and fiddlers scraped out half-remembered dances that were meant to sound cheerful, though the strings often sagged with the heat. The air was thick with smoke from torches, and beneath it lay another smell, sharper and more insistent. The stink of cats crammed too close together. The cages had been dragged to the center at dawn, lashed together with hemp rope that glistened with tar. Children pressed forward to point at the shifting shapes inside. Now and then a paw struck out through the bars, claws catching at nothing. Boys dared each other to step close enough to prod with sticks, squealing when the animals lashed back. The parents looked on with indulgent smiles, for wasn't this the way of things? Let them learn early who is master in the town, who commands the fire. The apprentice stood at the edge of the crowd, watching. He noticed how the knots were tied, snug cross-bound with sailor's precision. Whoever had strung those ropes had done so with a care that would have shamed the executioner's gallows. No murderer swinging from a beam was ever bound so neatly as these animals destined for fire. Beside him, a tanner bragged that the ropes would hold even as the basket swung high above the flames. "Best knots in France," the man said, puffing his chest. "Tighter than plague upon a parish." The apprentice gave a stiff nod. He had seen plague strike quick and cruel, and he wondered if rope truly deserved that comparison. But he kept his thoughts close. The square was no place for contrary words. Tradition did not tolerate loose tongues any better than it tolerated loose cats. Near the front, a merchant's wife held a child by the wrist, pointing proudly at the baskets that waited to be hoisted. "See them, darling? Last year they burned black ones, this year tabbies too. The devil hides in all stripes." The child nodded solemnly, as if she understood. The apprentice felt a twist in his gut. A century ago, when the plague scythed through the streets, that same child would have been told to thank the tabby at her feet for keeping rats from the granary. But memory, again, was a fickle ledger. Some deaths it recorded, some it struck out clean. Vendors hawked ribbons and charms, relics from saints and scraps of bone. The square smelled of singed hair already, though the torches had not yet been lowered. The crowd swelled tighter, pressing him forward until he could see the mayor and his retinue. Their chairs had been set on a raised platform, garlanded with green branches. The mayor dabbed his brow with a kerchief, looking as though he were about to preside over a wedding rather than a burning. His wife wore her best dress, her eyes gleaming with the promise of spectacle. The apprentice thought of the rats he'd glimpsed that morning, bold and fat near the riverbank. He thought of how easily they slipped through the alleys, how quick they were to vanish into shadows. He thought of how the cages creaked now, and how the crowd laughed at the sound. He kept his hands clenched tight, for it seemed to him that the joke was not on the cats but on the town itself. Only no one else was laughing for the same reason. Children dashed past him, chasing each other with dried tails, souvenirs from last year's fire. They brandished them like banners, proud as knights. The apprentice shuddered. He imagined what would happen when those same children grew old enough to tell stories, tales of how laughter kept the plague at bay, how burning whiskers in midsummer kept death itself from the door. He wondered if they would believe it even as the rats nibbled the grain beneath their feet. At the center, the fiddler struck up another tune, louder this time, covering the restless cries from the cages. The animals paced and scratched, sensing the air had turned against them. The crowd stamped their feet in time, a drumbeat of anticipation. The apprentice knew then that the festival had reached its point of no return. The ropes would hold, the baskets would rise. And the town, eager for joy, had bound its own shadow tighter than any knot could undo. The square quieted when the friar stepped forward. He was a thin man with a beard that pointed like a quill, and his voice carried more weight than his shoulders could bear. He raised his hands as though he might pluck the noise from the air, and slowly, obediently, the crowd hushed. Even the fiddlers lowered their bows. The cats, restless in their cages, hissed and spat, but their voices seemed thin against the friar's booming sermon. He began with the feast day of St. John, as was proper. Midsummer fires, he said, were blessed by heaven, their smoke rising as prayers to cleanse the town of sin. But his words shifted quickly, narrowing to the point of his sermon, cats, and the evil stitched into their hides. He spoke of witches who kept them as familiars, of demons who slipped into homes on silent paws. Black cats were worst, of course, but the friar assured his listeners that no color of fur was safe from corruption. The devil wore many coats. He listed stories the people already knew by heart, the witch in the village north of here, who had whispered to her cat before a storm flattened the fields, the miller's widow who kept a tom that yowled all night before her neighbor's child sickened and died. Each tale was carried on the friar's tongue with such authority that no one dared recall how often the town's gossip had already condemned the innocent. The crowd drank his words as if they were wine, nodding at each pause, as though the logic were iron and not smoke. The apprentice stood in the heat, listening. His master bowed his head reverently, as did most of the men nearby. The apprentice kept his gaze low, though his thoughts strayed. He thought of his uncle's stories, of the plague years when fleas had leapt from rat to man and back again, spreading death faster than any bell could toll it. Families had vanished in days. And yet through all that misery, cats had stalked the alleys, catching the vermin that the plague rode upon. A mouser in the granary could mean a season of bread instead of starvation. The friar thundered on, oblivious. He spoke of Lucifer's cunning, of how the devil might disguise himself in whiskers and slitted eyes. He warned of the unholy silence of a cat's step, how it was proof of sorcery. He told them that by burning these beasts, they struck at the very heart of hell's schemes. The people around him nodded, grateful for this neat arrangement of fear into cages. The apprentice wondered if anyone else noticed the irony. Here they stood, congratulating themselves on burning devils, while the real carriers of death, the rats bold as lords, skittered unharmed beneath the very boards of the platform. Children clutched their mothers' skirts, wide-eyed, drinking in every word. Some crossed themselves when the friar spoke of witches flying by night, cats clinging to their shoulders. Others whispered to each other that the devil himself had been seen slipping into barns, hiding in the haylofts with glowing eyes. Fear settled on the crowd like a net, and the apprentice felt its tug even as he resisted. Fear had its uses. It kept people quiet, it kept them gathered, it kept them obedient. The friar's voice rose, echoing against timbered walls. He promised the fire would cleanse the town, guard against pestilence, and drive evil from their homes. He promised joy in exchange for obedience, safety in exchange for spectacle, and the crowd, tired of memory and eager for certainty, believed him. To question the friar's words was to question the festival itself, and no man wished to be pointed out as a sympathizer of devils. The apprentice closed his eyes for a moment. He saw again the swollen buboes his grandmother had described, the quick graves, the endless funerals. He imagined the plague's return, rats bursting into every storehouse, fleas swarming unchecked, and no cats left to thin their ranks. He thought of the baskets behind him, filled with narrow faces and twitching tails, the very guardians the town would one day wish it still had. But he said nothing. He only stood, sweating in the sun, while the friar's words laid down a logic no rope could untangle. When the sermon ended, the torches were lifted higher. The crowd cheered, shouting blessings. The mayor clapped loudly, his wife beaming as though she had attended a play. The apprentice forced a cheer into his throat, though it lodged there like smoke. Theology, he realized, had been nailed to 4 legs, and no man dared pry it loose. The friar stepped back, satisfied, and the square exhaled in relief. For the sermon had not only condemned the cats, it had reminded every man, woman, and child that obedience was its own salvation. The hush that had settled over the square during the friar's sermon now cracked open like dry timber. The crowd pressed forward, hungry for the moment promised all morning. Torches were passed hand to hand, fire blossoming at their tips, a forest of flickering tongues licking at the sky. The heat of midsummer mingled with the smoke, thick enough to sting the eyes and stick in the throat. Men hauled at ropes until the baskets creaked upward. The cages swung high above the wood piled in the square's center, the cats inside hurling themselves at the bars, teeth bared, tails bristling. Their voices carried sharp and ragged across the cobbles, a choir of panic that made the apprentice's skin prickle. The townsfolk laughed, delighted by the shrieks. To them it was proof of the devil protesting, and nothing made a ritual more convincing than a scream. The apprentice tried not to watch, but his gaze was pulled toward the motion of the baskets. He noticed the ropes straining under the weight, tar dripping where the knots bit deep. The cats clung to one another, claws snagging in fur, eyes gleaming wide with reflected flame. He thought of the rats he had seen at dawn, bold near the riverbank, nosing through refuse as though the town were already theirs. He wondered if any of the people here noticed the rats slipping through their alleys even now, but no one looked down. Their eyes were fixed on the fire. The mayor raised a hand, as though he commanded the sun itself. Torches were lowered to the pyre, dry wood catching fast. A rush of flame leapt up, crackling, spitting sparks into the air. The crowd cheered as if victory itself had been lit. The baskets swayed above the blaze, heat rising to lick at their undersides. The cats screamed louder, bodies hurling against the bars in frantic waves. The sound was swallowed almost instantly by the roaring of the fire. The apprentice gagged as the first tendrils of burning fur reached his nose. Around him people clapped in time with the crackle of wood, their faces glowing orange in the firelight. Some wept with joy, Others sang snatches of hymns twisted into drinking songs. A woman near him shouted that the devil himself was being scourged from the town, and her neighbors cheered in agreement. The apprentice pressed his lips shut, for he could think only of the fleas scattering now, leaping from dying bodies into the crowd itself. He imagined them riding sleeves and hems, slipping into homes, waiting to bite. He wondered if anyone else tasted that bitter irony in the smoke. The flames climbed higher, blackening the baskets, hissing where sap boiled out of logs. The cat's cries weakened, thinned, then gave way to silence broken only by the roar of fire. The crowd's delight swelled as their victims' voices diminished, a grotesque inversion of mourning. Here, the absence of sound was proof of triumph. The apprentice shifted his weight from foot to foot, heart thudding. He remembered his grandmother's words again, "Without the cats the rats shall feast." She had whispered it, as if it were prophecy. He looked out over the square, at the smiling faces, the hands raised to heaven, the children on tiptoe to see. No one else seemed to hear the echo of that prophecy in the crackle of fire. No one else seemed to see the shadows slipping between feet, long-tailed and patient, emboldened by the absence of their only hunters. The mayor's wife clapped until her palms were red. The friar smiled beatifically, his sermon proved by smoke. And the apprentice stood, sweat dripping down his back, the stink of charred fur in his lungs, knowing he was watching not a cleansing but a slow undoing. For the town had lit its own funeral pyre and cheered as the flames rose higher. When the flames had done their work and the baskets no longer swung with movement, the festival shifted its shape. What had been solemn ceremony turned to revelry with the speed of a coin flipping. The crowd, satisfied that the devil had been scorched from their midst, turned to wine and laughter. Jugs were uncorked, meat skewers passed hand to hand, fiddlers struck up their tunes again, louder, more raucous this time. The square filled not with screams but with songs, and yet the smoke hung on, clinging to every throat like an accusation. The apprentice stood in the midst of it, watching the joy unfold. He saw the mayor raise a goblet, declaring another year of health secured. The friar nodded, accepting the thanks of the people as though he had personally delivered them from pestilence. Women clasped hands and danced in circles, skirts brushing the soot. Men slapped one another's shoulders, their faces red from drink, their laughter louder than the flames had been. Children played a crueler game. They crouched near the edge of the pyre, poking the charred remains with sticks, lifting what they could find from the ash. A whisker here, a claw there, souvenirs of purification. They tied them to bits of ribbon and tucked them into pockets, trophies to show their friends. The apprentice's stomach knotted. He thought of how children once played with marbles or carved figures, but now they played with the detritus of fear and flame. He wondered what sort of stories those children would carry forward, what lessons would be spun from soot. Near him, a man toasted loudly, "Another year without plague!" His companions echoed the cry, sloshing their cups in agreement. The apprentice nearly laughed, though not with joy. He imagined telling them the truth, that killing cats did nothing but fatten the rats, that no fire could cauterize the veins of pestilence running through their streets. But he said nothing. His master's warning echoed in his head. A craftsman's reputation suffers if he is seen standing against the crowd. He drank the sour wine handed to him and held his tongue. The fiddlers played faster, bowstrings snapping, heels stomping. A group of men dragged a barrel into the square, rolling it until the staves creaked and knocked out the top. Foam spilled across the cobbles, lapped up by dogs bold enough to creep near. Laughter rang out, louder than the crackle of dying embers. The apprentice thought again of the plague years, of funerals without end, of families sealed inside their houses. He wondered how many of the people singing now had buried kin in those days, and how quickly the memory had been traded for merriment. The smoke thickened, clinging to hair and cloth, but no one seemed to mind. They embraced it as proof of purity, a mark of their devotion. The apprentice gagged quietly into his sleeve, tasting burnt fur with every breath. He looked up to see the mayor's wife, cheeks flushed with wine, clapping as if this were the finest play performed at court. The friar smiled on it all, watching with satisfaction as his sermon bore fruit in laughter. Fear had been repackaged as joy, and the people bought it eagerly. As night deepened, torches lit the square brighter than the moon, and songs turned bawdy. The apprentice leaned against the wall, exhausted, feeling the ash settling into the seams of his clothes. He thought of the rats again. already moving through the dark, already gnawing grain, already free. He thought of fleas riding fur and cloth, tiny armies scattering into every corner. The crowd believed they had secured their safety, but the apprentice saw only the opposite. They had toasted to health with cups raised high, while pestilence licked its lips in the shadows. The laughter went on. The music tripped over itself in drunken haste. The town danced as if salvation were theirs, bought and paid for in screams. And the apprentice, silent among them, wondered how long it would be before the bells tolled again. Dawn crept into the square like a guilty guest, pale and uninvited. The fires had sunk to smoldering heaps, logs collapsing inward with soft sighs of smoke. What had roared and crackled through the night was now a bed of ash, grey as bone dust, scattered with blackened fragments. The laughter had spent itself, leaving only snores in doorways and the sour tang of wine spilled in gutters. The apprentice rose early, as habit demanded. His master's shop front needed sweeping, no matter what the town had done the night before. He stepped into the square and found it hushed, the revelry gone to silence, but for the creak of shutters opening and the cawing of crows that had come to pick at what remained. Children were already at play, skipping among the ashes, kicking up clouds of soot as if it were harmless snow. Their hands were blackened to the wrist, but their parents only smiled and told them not to wander too close to the embers. The smell clung worse than ever in the cool air of morning. Burnt fur, acrid and heavy, settled in his lungs. He pulled a cloth over his mouth as he swept, though it did little to block the taste. Charred bones poked from the ash like snapped quills. Now and then, children stooped to collect them, holding them aloft as relics. Some braided whiskers into their hair, daring each other to wear them all day. The apprentice shivered. They called it purification, but to him it looked like inheritance. The passing down of cruelty, small hands eager to grasp it. He paused to rest, leaning on his broom, and watched the mayor strut through the square. The man's finery was dulled by soot, his shoes stained, yet he carried himself like a conqueror returning from war. His wife followed, still flushed with pride, accepting greetings from those who had risen early enough to pay homage. The friar trailed behind them, head bowed in mock humility, though his eyes shone with satisfaction. Their victory was painted on the air, though the enemy they claimed to have slain had never stood before them. The apprentice's gaze dropped to the ground. A rat, plump and unhurried, nosed through the refuse at the square's edge. Another darted out from beneath the woodpile, bold as any nobleman. The creatures scurried freely, whiskers twitching, claws scratching on cobble. The apprentice watched them and felt the chill of foreboding settle in his bones. The town had burned its guardians and left the true enemy unscathed. The plague had not vanished, it had merely bided its time. He swept harder, though the soot only rose in clouds and settled again. Each stroke seemed useless, each effort undone by the weight of ash. Around him, neighbors began to clean their thresholds, scraping the night's residue from stone. They spoke cheerfully, comparing songs sung, cups emptied, partners twirled. None spoke of the baskets or the screams. Memory was selective, and already the festival was being polished into a story of joy. The apprentice kept silent. He knew better than to voice his thoughts. A craftsman's reputation was worth more than truth, and truth weighed nothing against tradition. Yet in his chest he carried a quiet dread, the knowledge that the town had cheered its own undoing. When the church bells rang for the morning mass, the sound carried over the roofs, steady and familiar. The people crossed themselves and moved toward the nave, soot streaking their brows like ashes on Ash Wednesday. The apprentice lingered by his broom, listening to the tolling fade. It seemed to him a rehearsal, a whisper of what would come when pestilence returned. The bells had rung for celebration today. Tomorrow, or the year after, they would toll for the dead. He swept once more, scattering bones into the gutter, and wondered how long until the town learned the price of its joy. Though the tale above is imagined through the eyes of one apprentice, the practice it describes was real. Cat burning was a ritual recorded in parts of medieval and early modern Europe, most notably in France. In Paris, during midsummer festivals, cats were sometimes placed in baskets or suspended over large bonfires and burned as part of public spectacle. The act was framed as both entertainment and purification, with onlookers treating the animal's suffering as a sign of evil being destroyed. Historians note that cats had long been associated with witchcraft and the devil, their nocturnal habits and unblinking eyes making them symbols of sorcery. Black cats especially were feared as familiars of witches. Burning them was thought to ward off misfortune and protect communities from disease and ill luck. Festivals often blurred the line between religious ritual and carnival amusement, with clergy sometimes endorsing the acts, while crowds treated them as holiday sport. Ironically, the demonization of cats may have worsened outbreaks of plague. By reducing the population of animals that preyed on rats, towns left themselves more vulnerable to the rodents and fleas that carried Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for the Black Death. What was celebrated as a triumph over evil may, in fact, have helped clear the way for the return of pestilence. By the 18th century, attitudes toward animals began to shift, and such practices came to be condemned as barbaric. Today, cat burning survives only as a stark reminder of how tradition, fear, and spectacle could override compassion, even when the cost was survival itself.